Hi, friends. All right. I think we're on part 5. I'm not entirely sure. I'll admit I didn't go back and listen to the one I did yesterday. So, part 5 of Sara Crew, or What Happened at Miss Minchin's by Frances Hodgson Burnett. I pre-apologize if the airplanes go over today. We live not too far from an air base, and today it seems like they're flying. On my bookmark for today. Isn't that pretty? I've had it for ages. I've got so many bookmarks. This one says, with freedom, flowers, books, and the moon, who could not be perfectly happy? By Oscar Wilde. I like it. All right. So where we left off here. It was just when this was beginning to be so apparent that Miss Minchin sometimes stared at her questioningly that another wonderful thing happened. A man came to the door and left several parcels. All were addressed, in large letters, to the little girl in the attic. I'm going to angle this because you probably don't need to be seeing me this whole entire time. There. You can see the book a little bit too, I guess. That's always a good thing. Okay, yes, a man came to the door and left several parcels. All were addressed, in large letters, to the little girl in the attic. Sara herself was sent to open the door, and she took them in. She laid the 2 largest parcels down on the hall table and was looking at the address when Miss Minchin came down the stairs. Take the things to the young lady to whom they belong, she said. Don't stand there staring at them. They belong to me, answered Sara quietly. To you? Exclaimed Miss Minchin. What do you mean? I don't know where they came from, said Sara, but they're addressed to me. Miss Minchin came to her side and looked at them with an excited expression. Well, what is in them? She demanded. I don't know, said Sara. Open them, she demanded, still more excitedly. Well, Sara did as she was told. They contained pretty and comfortable clothing of different kinds, shoes and stockings and gloves, a warm coat, and even an umbrella. On the pocket of the coat was pinned a paper on which was written, To be worn every day. Will be replaced by others when necessary. Miss Minchin was quite agitated. This was an incident which suggested strange things to her sordid mind. Could it be that she had made a mistake after all, and that the child so neglected and so unkindly treated by her had some powerful friend in the background? It would not be very pleasant if there should be such a friend, and he or she should learn all the truth about the thin, shabby clothes, the scant food, and the hard work. She felt queer indeed and uncertain, and she gave a side glance at Sara. Well, she said in a voice she had not used since the day the child lost her father. Well, someone is very kind to you. As you have the things, and you are to have new ones when they are worn out, you may as well go and put them on and look respectable. And after you are dressed, you may come downstairs and learn your lessons in the schoolroom. So it happened that, about half an hour afterwards, Sara struck the entire schoolroom of pupils dumb with amazement by making her appearance in a costume which she had never worn since the change of fortune whereby she ceased to be a show pupil and a parlor boarder. She scarcely seemed to be the same Sara. She was neatly dressed in a pretty gown of warm browns and reds, and even her stockings and slippers were nice and dainty. Perhaps someone has left her a fortune, one of the girls whispered. I always thought something would happen to her. She is so queer. That night, when Sara went to her room, she carried out a plan she had been devising for some time. She wrote a note to her unknown friend. It ran as follows. I hope you will not think it is not impolite. Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me. I hope you will not think it is not polite that I should write this note to you when you wish to keep yourself a secret. But I do not mean to be impolite, only to try. Can you hear the planes? Let's see. Or to try to find out at all. Only I want to thank you for being so kind to me, so beautiful kind, and making everything like a fairy story. I am so grateful to you, and I am so happy. I used to be so lonely and cold and hungry, and now, oh, just think what you have done for me. Please let me say just these words. It seems as if I ought to say them. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Signed, the little girl in the attic. Sorry, my throat is a little scratchy today. I drink some nice warm coffee. The next morning, she left this on the little table, and it was taken away with the other things. She felt sure the magician had received it, and she was happier for the thought. A few nights later, a very odd thing happened. She found something in the room which she certainly would never have expected. When she came in, as usual, she saw something small and dark in the chair. An odd, tiny figure, which turned towards her a little, weird-looking, wistful face. Why, it's the monkey, she cried. It is the Indian gentleman's monkey. Where can he have come from? It was the monkey, sitting up and looking so like a mite of a child that it really was quite pathetic. And very soon Sara found out how he had happened to be in her room. The skylight was open, and it was easy to guess that he had crept out of the master's garret window, which was only a few feet away and perfectly easy to get in and out of, even for a climber less agile than a monkey. He had probably climbed out to the garret on a tour of investigation, and getting out upon the roof and being attracted by the light in Sara's attic, had crept in. I cannot read today. I'm so sorry. At all events, this seemed quite reasonable, and there he was. And when Sara went to him, he actually put out his queer elfish little hands, caught her dress, and jumped into her arms. Oh, you queer, poor, ugly, foreign little thing, said Sara, caressing him. I can't help liking you. You look like a sort of baby, but I'm so glad you're not, because your mother could not be proud of you, and nobody would dare to say you were like any of your relations. But I do like you. You have such a forlorn little look in your face. Perhaps you are sorry you are so ugly, and it's always on your mind. I wonder if you have a mind. The monkey sat and looked at her while she talked, and seemed much interested in her remarks. If one could judge by his eyes and his forehead, and the way he moved his head up and down, and held it sideways and scratched it with his little hand. He examined Sara quite seriously, and anxiously too. He felt the stuff of her dress, touched her hands, climbed up and examined her ears, and then sat on her shoulder, holding a lock of her hair, looking mournful, but not at all agitated. Upon the whole, he seemed pleased with Sara. But I must take you back, she said to him, though I'm sorry to have to go do it. The company you would be to a person. She lifted him from her shoulder, set him on her knee, and gave him a bit of cake. He sat and nibbled it, and then put his head on one side, looked at her, wrinkled his forehead, and then nibbled again in the most companionable manner. But you must go home, said Sara at last, and she took him in her arms to carry him downstairs. Evidently he did not want to leave the room, for as they reached the door, he clung to her neck and gave a little scream of anger. Oh, you mustn't be ungrateful, monkey, said Sara. You ought to be fondest of your own family. I am sure the Lascar is good to you. Nobody saw her on her way out, and very soon she was standing on the Indian gentleman's front steps, and the Lascar had opened the door for her. I found your monkey in my room, she said in Hindustani. I think he got in through the window. The man began a rapid outpouring of thanks, but just as he was in the midst of them, a fretful, hollow voice was heard through the open door of the nearest room. The instant he heard it, the Lascar disappeared and left Sara still holding the monkey. It was not many moments, however, before he came back to bring a message. His master had told him to bring Missy into the library. The Sahib was very ill, but he wished to see Missy. Sara thought this odd, but she remembered reading stories of Indian gentlemen who, having no constitutions, were extremely cross and full of whims, and who must have their own way. So she followed the Lascar. When she entered the room, the Indian gentleman was lying on an easy chair, propped up with pillows. He looked frightfully ill. His yellow face was thin, and his eyes were hollow. He gave Sara a rather curious look, as if it was she, as, oh. He gave Sara a rather curious look. It was as if she wakened him some anxious interest. You live next door, he said. Yes, Sara answered. I live at Miss Minchin's. She keeps a boarding school? Well, yes, said Sara. And you are one of her pupils. Sara hesitated a moment. I don't know exactly what I am, she replied. Well, why not? Asked the Indian gentleman. The monkey gave a tiny squeak, and Sara stroked him. At first I was a pupil and a parlor boarder, but now... What do you mean by at first? Asked the Indian gentleman. When I was first taken there by my papa. Well, what has happened since then? Said the invalid, staring at her and knitting his brows with a puzzled expression. My papa died, said Sara. He lost all his money, and there was none left for me, and so there was no one to take care of me or pay Miss Minchin. So you were sent up into the garret and neglected and made into a half-starved little drudge? Put in the Indian gentleman. That is about it, isn't it? The color deepened on Sara's cheeks. Well, there was no one to take care of me and no money, she said. I belonged to nobody. What did your father mean by losing his money? Said the gentleman fretfully. Well, he did not lose it himself, she said. He had a friend he was fond of, and it was his friend who took his money. I don't know how. I don't understand. He trusted his friend too much. She saw the invalid start, the strangest start, as if he had been suddenly frightened. Then he spoke nervously and excitedly. There is an old story, he said. It happens every day. But sometimes those who are blamed, those who do the wrong, don't intend it and are not so bad. It may happen through a mistake, a miscalculation. They may not be so bad. No, said Sara, but the suffering is just as bad for the others. It killed my papa. The Indian gentleman pushed aside some of the gorgeous wraps that covered him. Come a little nearer and let me look at you, she said. His voice seemed very strange. It had a more nervous and excited tone than before. Sara had an odd fancy that he was half afraid to look at her. She came and stood nearer, the monkey clinging to her and watching his master anxiously over his shoulder. The Indian gentleman's hollow, restless eyes fixed themselves on her. Yes, he said at last. Yes, I can see it. Tell me your father's name. His name was Ralph Crewe, said Sara. Captain Crewe. Perhaps a sudden thought flashed upon her. Perhaps you may have heard of him. He died in India. The Indian gentleman sank back upon his pillows. He looked very weak and seemed out of breath. Yes, he said, I knew him. I was his friend. I meant no harm. If he had only lived, he would have known. It turned out well, after all. He was a fine young fellow. I was fond of him. I will make it right. Call the man. Sara thought he was going to die, and there was no need to call the Lascar. He might have been waiting at the door. He was in the room and by his master's side in an instant. He seemed to know what to do. He lifted the drooping head and gave the invalid something in a small glass. The Indian gentleman lay panting for a few minutes, and then he spoke in an exhausted but eager voice, addressing the Lascar in Hindustani. Go for Carmichael, he said. Tell him to come here at once. Tell him I have found the child. Ooh. And that's where I'm stopping. At least for a little while. Maybe I'll be back again in a little bit. That was part 5. Sara Crewe, or What Happened at Miss Minchin's by Frances Hodgson Burnett.